So, Alex, what is your process when creating music for this movie?
It sounds arty, but you have to watch it and you have to see what it says to you. A lot of input from Steve, of course, but you have to watch it, and then eventually you watch it 3 or 4 or 5 times, 100 times, and then you start hearing something. You start hearing instruments, or you hear melody or chords or something. And then the hardest part, at least for me, is to try to figure out what's in your head onto some sort of instrument.
So, what have you learned about the scoring process while getting a part of this film?
I've learned that you have to put your ego to the side. If you come into it like I did, being this is the first movie I ever scored, the idea was to go in like, I'm going to revolutionize what kind of music goes into movies, and I quickly learned that's not going to happen. That you have to learn. It's a lot like painting. Whatever, you need to learn the techniques first, and to be able to express your point of view. And I learned that there's reasons why certain instruments are the cliche instruments. There's a reason why the music tends to be at a certain pace. I learned lots and lots of stuff. I definitely couldn't do a score like in big Hollywood movies. It's different than anything I've ever done. And the only thing from my past that I could use was just that drive to just keep going and try to do something.
What was the most challenging part when actually putting this score together?
Not doing what I thought was appropriate, but what the movie demanded. So again, I came in with some ideas of instruments and the general idea of what it would sound like, and none of that really worked. What I had to do is listen to the movie and listen to the director and do what was needed, not necessarily what I felt would be fun to do, but what was appropriate.
How did this project come to be? What's your history behind it?
Steve contacted a band I was in the early 2000s to give 1 or 2 songs to a movie project he was doing called Pop Punk Zombies through MySpace, and that developed into us basically giving we had a fledgling music label at the time, and we gave basically every piece of music we had recorded over to him to use at his disposal, and we ended up creating an original. We did the music for an original song in the movie, and then he went on to do a bunch of other things, and I recorded some music by myself in my home studio, and I sent links to that to friends, and Steve was one of those people, and he was like, "Oh, you're still making music? Well, guess what?" And he offered me this opportunity to make a movie, which I was reluctant at the start, but then I realized that, opportunities don't always come around too often. So I jumped at the chance to try to do it, and here I am now.
There's a lot of different instruments that are going on in this, and some of them surprised me, especially with the opening score. It had a very Cedar Rose kind of feel to it, with these big kind of dry sounds mixed with these kind of wet concepts. But thinking it more in simple terms, what instruments did you choose to make this particular score?
I made 3 scores prior to this. All of that sounded pretty lousy. I did ones that were basically feedback guitar and noise and weird drums. Didn't work. And I did more of a classic one on just a synthesizer, and that didn't work. The instruments that I picked, there's some samples, there's some analog synthesizers, some digital synthesizers. There's a remakes of classic instruments on your DAW, those sort of things. I would just page through things, and eventually I would find things that, there's a reason why strings are generally used. They work well with dialogue, with background noises and things like that. It has that kind of serious sound to it. This is a movie because there's strings playing. It's a realization that if you see a movie that doesn't have strings in it at all, you'll probably say, well, that movie's weird. So there's a reason why you do those sort of things. There's a sci-fi element, so we used synthesizers or samplers that sounded like classic synthesizers and samplers from the 70s and the 80s to give that kind of auto world sound. Because the movie really has that classic feel of a classic movie, and also that sci-fi unknown feeling.
What was something you kind of found surprising about actually scoring the music for this film?
I always like want to have music at a certain pace, and what I quickly learned was cut that in half. So if you want it at a pace like this, it'd work a lot better if it was. You have to where if you're writing pop music, there's a certain speed that works well. But with movies, you have to bring it way down. And I remember some of the songs I'd write with Steve initially, and Steve was actually around for creating one of the songs. He was like, "That's great. Can you make it like half speed?" So I was like, "Oh yeah, right." And just the amount of material you have to create, it was overwhelming.
So what do you mean by it was overwhelming? Like, what was this amount? Because in the past, you've worked in punk bands and you've worked in a lot of like, classic, like, I start with a guitar, I end it with a guitar. How, when you say massive, like what type of massive was it?
The classic composer songs, I mean, it's every 4 bars is a complete new change. And there's moments of what we did that have that. The score is 20 songs. I don't think there's anything less than 3 minutes on it. And where like a pop song, you have lyrical content and a human voice to carry along your interest. And then you can have like a guitar solo here. Now you have nothing. Like you have just, some chords. Okay, well that's boring in like a second. So you have to be thinking that you need to be adjusting towards what's happening on film, but you also have to be having something interesting happening in the music, and it has to be a lot. And it's dense, and there's musical changes, there's instrument changes. So basically you come up with a concept and then you realize that in like 30 seconds time, you need to have a complete new concept all the time for 20 tracks. That's why a lot of guys or people starting out doing something would have the same idea that I had originally. We're like, I'll just let the guitar feedback and it'll make like this spooky noise, and then there'll be like a drum or something. And that's what I thought, and like I could whip that up in a weekend, and if I had some of my band members around, we could do that in a weekend. And that's what a lot of people with my background do. What I realized that isn't going to work for this movie, and that I need to do that where you write a piece of music which develops and develops and develops and develops, and you have to do that 20 times.
So what was the major like difference between coming in from like your past as a musician to approaching a score for the first time?
It's not what you want to do. It's a job. It's a job that in this scenario pays with the pleasure of doing the job. So that phrase, the reward for hard work is more work, that is the thing. And it was something, the idea of subtlety was something, if you're playing a punk band, that doesn't really exist. And it really did push my boundaries of what I knew about music. I wouldn't have spent as much time on the earlier things. I would have done more talking with Steve before. Because it's my first one, I really did like basically 4 scores, not complete, but 4 different ideas. I would have spent less time messing around recording. Because someone like me, when you get an idea, you just want to get in there and start doing it right away. And there's a benefit to having that sort of personality. But as you're getting older, you need to kind of take the time and think it out. And that's something that's hard for me to do because I just want to get the work done. So taking the time and thinking it out, developing things more, that would have been a lot easier. Also, not doing the first song first. And then knowing you want to have a bigger song at the end and leaving it for the end. That would have been, it would have been way smarter to leave the simple, easy, I can get it done in a couple hours songs for, the middle. And also, but main thing is to have better development before jumping in. If I did it again for another project, which I'd like to, not trying to steer myself away from cliches, because cliches are cliches for a reason.